George Lucas finally breaks his silence about recent Star Wars projects and talks about the movie industry in general over the weekend at Cannes Film Festival. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, sold the company of Lucasfilm to Disney in 2012. At the time, many fans were upset about this because George Lucas is the maker of the franchise that they love so much. But George was getting older, he knew that there was going to be a sequel trilogy, and as he said, he didn't want to be in his 80s still making Star Wars. And now fast forward 12 years later, the Star Wars fandom is extremely divided, and over the last 12 years, George Lucas has remained pretty silent. Until now. Over the weekend, George was at Cannes Film Festival to receive an award, but he sat down for an interview and talked about Star Wars. Now, what George Lucas said about Star Wars is not as crazy as people online are making you think, but we'll get to that. And he talked about the film industry in general because he's not really a part of it that much anymore, and he's watching it from afar. And what George had to say was pretty much what everybody else is thinking. Hollywood has lost its originality. George talks about how everything now seems to be a sequel. And that's not for the lack of original ideas from writers and directors, it's because of the Hollywood studios. The higher-ups working at those studios don't know a good idea if it hit them in the head, and all they care about is money. So if the original movie made a lot of money, then they're going to make either spin-offs or sequels of that franchise. And it seems like now almost everything that releases is a sequel or a spin-off of a franchise. Think about the biggest movies that are in the movie theater right now. A Godzilla movie, there's not 100 of those. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, yeah, that's a spin-off. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, those movies are 50 years old. And even Fall Guy, which comes out this weekend, is a remake of an older show. So George Lucas is not lying when he says that everything now seems to be a sequel or a spin-off, because Hollywood studios see that as just more money, and original ideas are hard to come by. Even the biggest movie of this year so far is Dune Part 2, and that's a sequel first of all, but also a recreation of a movie from the 80s and based off of a book from the 60s. So George Lucas, although he hasn't been making movies for a long time, still sees what everybody else sees. The movie industry is in big trouble. Not that some of these movies aren't really good, because Dune Part 2 was fantastic, but at some point, all of these sequels and spin-offs are going to come back to bite them in the ass. But then George Lucas goes to talk about Star Wars. Like I said at the top of the video, people are completely spinning this out of proportion, because although George Lucas does talk about how they didn't go with his own ideas and how it's a little bit different from what he thought was going to happen, and people online have been taking his words and spinning them to try to make a quick buck. Because here's what George Lucas actually said. He said, and I quote, "I was the only one who really knew what Star Wars was, who actually knew the world, because there's a lot of it. The Force, for example, nobody understood the Force." Now, before I keep going, because there is more, he's not wrong. He's really the only one who knows what the Force is, how it works, and how pretty much every character should work in the Star Wars franchise. But over the last 14 years, he hasn't really been involved. Or has he? He continues and he says, quote, "When they started other ones, after I sold the company, a lot of ideas that were in the originals sort of got lost. But that's the way it is. You give it up. You give it up." And that's where almost everybody who's talking about this stops. But that's not where George Lucas stopped. And from just based off of that, yeah, that's a bunch of news headlines and makes you probably a few clicks. But that's not what George really said, because this quote continues. As he says, and I quote, "These new films have a lot of talent, great ideas, and production. I feel like they have come from my children, and sometimes it hurts a little when they grow up and get away from you." So George still feels like these new Star Wars projects are created by his children, especially when it comes to Dave Filoni, who he trained as his own apprentice pretty much. And now Dave Filoni has a hand in every Star Wars project that is being created. And yeah, sometimes when your kid grows up and moves out of the house and becomes their own person, you don't have a say on what they're going to do. And maybe sometimes you disagree with what they will do. But he still sees the new Star Wars as a lot of great ideas and productions. Of course, not every idea is the exact same as George Lucas would have done it, but that's because he's not making the Star Wars. He sold the company 12 years ago. But I see this as actual good news. Because George Lucas could have come out and said, "This Star Wars has nothing to do with what I created 47 years ago, and it's all trash." But he didn't. and George Lucas might actually be a little bit more involved than you might think, seeing that he's been on the set for The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, Andor, and even confirmed recently that he was involved in the creation of the Kenobi show. So don't believe everything you hear online, because it's not usually the full story. And George Lucas wasn't just here to crap on how the new stuff didn't really fit with his original ideas. He was explaining how they're different, and that's not a bad thing. But tell me what you think in the comments section below. Do you agree with George Lucas's take on Hollywood? That only sequels and spin-off movies are being created and original ideas are just not even there anymore? And do you agree with him on current Star Wars? It's being created by people that aren't George Lucas, but it feels like his children. And sometimes it hurts a little when they grow up and move on from you. Tell me what you think in the comment section below, because the next Star Wars show is only 9 days away, and that is The Acolyte. And it's possible that a very familiar face from one of George Lucas's prequel movies, Plo Koon, could be in The Acolyte show, but I explain why I think he's definitely in there in this video right here.